Two cripples, Edogawa Rampo. The two had just left the hot spring, finished a game of Go, puffed on a cigarette, and sipped a cup of strong sencha green tea, exchanging small talk as usual. The mild winter sunlight was filling the shoji screens, warming the Japanese-style room. In a large brazier, a kettle was boiling with a drowsiness-inducing sound. It was a dreamy, peaceful winter afternoon at the hot spring resort. What had started out as meaningless small talk soon turned into a retrospective conversation. Mr. Saito, a guest, began to talk about his experiences in the Qingdao War. Ihara, the owner of the room, held his hand over a brazier and listened silently to the gory tale. The faint chirping of a bush warbler could be heard as an interlude to the story. It was a scene worthy of recounting the past. Saito's face, which was so cruelly disfigured, was a fitting reciter of such a saga. He recounted how he had been hit by a shell fragment, pointing to a bruise on the right half of his face. He also said that he had several knife wounds all over his body that hurt in the winter, and that is why he came to the hot spring. He would also say, "When I was young, I too had considerable ambition, but I'm finished when I look like this." With these words, Mr. Saito concluded his long war story. Ihara remained silent for a moment, as if savoring the aftermath of the story. This man has had his whole life ruined by the war. He is a kind of cripple, just like me. But this man still has the comfort of honor, but not for me. Ihara cringed as he was once again touched by old emotional wounds. And he thought Saito, who was suffering from old physical wounds, was still happy. Ihara was touched by the old emotional wounds once again, but he thought that Saito, who was suffering from old physical injuries, was still happy. "Now I will ask you to listen to my confession," Ihara said. "It may be a little too somber after the heroic war stories." After brewing a pot of tea again, Mr. Ihara said meaningfully, "I'd love to hear your confession." Mr. Saito replied immediately. He glanced at Mr. Ihara as if waiting for something to happen, but immediately and casually lowered his eyes. At that moment, Mr. Ihara thought it was suspicious. He felt that the expression on Mr. Sato's face, as he had just glanced at him, was somehow familiar. Ever since he had first met Saito, which was only 10 days ago, he had had the feeling that there was some kind of a connection between the two of them, like a promise from a previous life. And as the days went by, this feeling gradually deepened. Otherwise, Ihara thought, it was impossible for two people from different backgrounds and staying in different hotels to become so close in just a few days. "This is very strange. I'm sure I've seen this man's face somewhere before." There's no doubt about it, Ihara thought. But for some reason, he couldn't remember where he had seen him. Perhaps this man and I were playmates a long, long time ago, when we were children, when we were still young and unaware. I'm sure you will have a very interesting story to tell. Come to think of it, isn't today's weather nice and reminiscent of the old days? Mr. Saito said, as if urging him on. Mr. Ihara had never shared his embarrassing personal story with others. In fact, he had tried to hide it as much as possible. He had tried to forget about it himself. But today, for some reason, he suddenly felt the urge to tell his story. "I was born to the head of a rather old merchant family in the town of XXX. However, probably because I was spoiled by my parents, I was often sickly from a young age and was delayed by a year or two in school because of it. But other than that, I had no particular problems and grew up normally, going from elementary school to junior high school and then to XX University in Tokyo, although I was later than others. After moving to Tokyo, my physical condition was relatively good, and as I began to specialize in a certain department, my interests began to develop, and I gradually made close friends. In retrospect, those were truly the peak of my life. However, it was less than a year after I moved to Tokyo. I suddenly became aware of something terrible." As he spoke, Mr. Ihara shuddered slightly. Mr. Saito, with his cigarette propped up on a brazier, began to listen attentively. "It was one morning. As I was getting ready to go to school, a friend of mine who lived in the same boarding house came into my room. As he waited for me to change into my kimono, he said to me coldly, You were very eloquent last night, but I did not understand what he meant. I asked him, by eloquent, do you mean that I argued with you last night? I asked back with a scornful look on my face, and my friend suddenly burst out laughing, clutching his stomach. When I asked him why, he told me that late the night before, I had come into his sleeping room, roused him, and suddenly started an argument with him. I seemed to be debating about the comparative views of Plato and Aristotle on women, but after I had said what I wanted to say, I quickly pulled out of the room without listening to my friend's opinion. It was as if I had been tricked by a fox. You must have had a dream. I went to bed early last night and was fast asleep until just now, so there's no way I could have done something like that, I replied, to which my friend angrily insisted. The proof that it wasn't a dream is that I couldn't fall asleep after you left and read a book for a long time. And what's most certain is that I wrote this postcard at that time. No one writes postcards while they're asleep, after all. While I was waiting for the instructor to arrive, my friend asked me with a thoughtful look in his eyes. Have you ever been in the habit of sleepwalking? He asked. I gasped when I heard that, as if I had just stumbled upon something terrible. In fact, I had that habit. I used to talk in my sleep from a very young age, and if someone made fun of me in my sleep, I would clearly respond to them in my sleep. And in the morning, I didn't remember a bit of it. It was so unusual that it became the subject of neighborhood gossip. But it happened in elementary school, and when I grew up, it went away as if I had forgotten about it. And when I told him about it, he said, well, then it must have come back. In other words, you are a kind of sleepwalker. Suddenly, I began to worry. I didn't know exactly what sleepwalking was, but phrases like playing while sleeping and crime while sleepwalking kept popping into my head in a weird way. To begin with, when I was young, I was extremely embarrassed about being half asleep. I was very worried that if this happened often, it would be a big problem. A couple of days later, I mustered up the courage to go to a doctor I knew and consulted with him. The doctor said, you may be sleepwalking, but you needn't worry too much if you have only one attack. If you worry too much, you will make your illness worse. Be as calm as possible, live a carefree, regular life, and maintain your health. If you do so, you will naturally recover from such illnesses, he told me in a very optimistic tone. I gave up and went home. Unfortunately, I am a very nervous person by nature, and once something like that happened to me, I was so worried about it that I couldn't do anything, including my studies. I was scared every day, hoping that it would not recur, but fortunately, a month or so passed without incident. I thought I was saved, but it was only a short-lived pleasure, and soon I had a worse seizure than before. When I awoke in the morning, I found a strange pocket watch under my pillow. While I was thinking it was strange, one of the company employees who was staying at the same lodging started screaming, "My watch is missing! My watch is missing!" I realized that it was me, but I was too embarrassed to go and apologize. In the end, I had my friend explain that I was sleepwalking, and the problem was finally resolved after I returned the watch to the company employee. I tried everything I could to cure this embarrassing disease, buying and reading books on the subject, trying various health methods, switching to several doctors, and so on. But instead of getting better, it only got worse and worse. Once a month, twice in the worst case, I would have one of these attacks, and little by little, the area of my sleepwalking grew wider and wider. Each time I would either bring something belonging to someone else or drop my own belongings at the place I visited. If it weren't for this, some things would have gone unnoticed. But the bad news is that there is usually some evidence left behind. Or perhaps I had frequent seizures in other cases, and because there was no evidence, no one ever found out about them. In any case, it was a creepy story. On one occasion, I slipped out of my rooming house in the middle of the night and wandered around the cemetery of a nearby temple. To make matters worse, a company employee, who was also staying at the boarding house, saw me through a low hedge on his way home from a party and remarked, "There's a ghost over there," causing quite a commotion when it turned out to be me. To others, it was just a comedy, but to me at the time, you would have to be in the same boat to understand how hard it was and how weird it was for me. In the beginning, I was very afraid that I would make a mistake again tonight, or that I would sleepwalk through the night. But then I began to dread going to sleep itself. It was ridiculous, but just looking at the bedding, even if it wasn't my own, was enough to make me feel uncomfortable. The most restful time of the day for most people is the most painful for me. What an unfortunate situation I was in. Besides, I had one dreadful worry from the beginning of these seizures. I hoped that the comedy would continue indefinitely, and that I would only be a laughingstock to others. But I feared that it might one day lead to an irreversible tragedy. As I mentioned earlier, I had collected as many books as I could on sleepwalking and read them over and over again. So I knew many examples of crimes committed by sleepwalkers. And among them were many bloody cases that made me shudder. It was no wonder that the mere sight of the bedding made me feel sick. Eventually, I began to realize that I could no longer live like this. I decided to quit school and return to my hometown. One day, about 6 months after my first seizure, I wrote a long letter to my parents, telling them about my illness. And while I was waiting for their reply, the thing I had been dreading finally happened. It was an irreversible tragedy that would ruin my whole life. Mr. Saito listened without moving. His eyes, however, seemed to be saying something more than being drawn by the interest of the story. The New Year's holiday season had passed, and there were not many visitors to the hot springs, so the place was quiet and still. Not a single sound could be heard. Not even the chirping of birds could be heard. The two cripples were facing each other with unusual tension in a world far removed from the rest of the world. It happened exactly 20 years ago, in the fall of 1900X. It is a very old story. One morning I woke up and noticed that the house was somehow noisy. Being sleepwalking, I was immediately overcome with a feeling of unease, wondering if I had made another mistake. But as I lay there for a while watching the situation, I began to sense that something was not right. A horrible and indescribable feeling of foreboding crawled up my back. I looked around the room nervously. Something was wrong. There seemed to be something different in the room than when I went to bed last night. I got up and examined it carefully, and sure enough, I saw something strange. At the entrance of the room, there was a small wrapping cloth that I did not recognize. I saw it, and to my surprise, I suddenly grabbed it and threw it into the closet. Then I closed the closet door, looked around like a thief, and sighed with relief. Just then, the door opened noiselessly and one of my friends came in. He whispered to me meaningfully in a low voice, "A terrible incident occurred." Worried that he had seen what I had done earlier, I didn't reply. So my friend said, "An old man has been murdered. A thief broke in last night. Come with me." And with that, he walked away. When I heard this, my throat became blocked, and I could not move for a while. But I finally got myself together and left the room to see what was going on. And what do you think I saw and heard? I was so shocked that I left the room to see what was going on. I still remember the strange feeling I had at that time as clearly as if it were yesterday, even 20 years later. In particular, that old man's horrific face of death has remained in front of my eyes whether I sleep or wake up, and I have never been able to get away from it. Mr. Ihara looked around as if he could not bear the fear. The old man's son and daughter-in-law were visiting relatives for the night, so he was alone and sleeping in a room next to the entrance. One of the housemaids became suspicious and looked into his room, only to find the old man lying supine in his bed, strangled to death with a flannel collar that he had been wrapped around him. Upon investigation, it was discovered that after killing the old man, the murderer took the key from his drawers, opened the drawer of his chest of drawers, and stole a large amount of bonds and stock certificates from the handheld safe in it. The boarding house was very easy to break into because the entrance was always unlocked for guests who came home late at night. But the old owner was a very clever man, so everyone was relieved that there would be no problems. The only thing they found was a soiled handkerchief under the old landlord's pillow, which was taken by an official. After a while, I was standing in front of the closet in my room, putting my hand in and out of it, trying to decide whether to open it or not. In the closet, there is the wrapping, as you know. I would examine it, and if it contained the property of the old man who was killed, I would go to, well, you can imagine how I felt at that time. It is really a last-ditch attempt on my life. I stood there for a long time, unable to open the closet with such life-shortening thoughts, until finally I decided to examine the wrappings. Immediately I was dizzy, and for a while I felt as if I had fainted. There it was. Inside that wrapping was a bond and a stock certificate. I later found out that the handkerchief that had fallen at the scene was also mine. In the end, I turned myself in that day. I was interrogated repeatedly by various officials, and then I was taken to a detention center, which is still a horrifying experience for me even now that I recall it. I felt like I was daydreaming. Because crimes committed by sleepwalkers are rare, a lengthy investigation was conducted, including the examination of medical specialists and testimony from my lodgers. But they also knew that I was the son of a wealthy family, and there was no reason for me to commit murder for money. Furthermore, it was obvious from the testimony of my friends that I was a sleepwalker. And my father had asked 3 lawyers to come to Tokyo. I had a friend who first discovered my sleepwalking, a man named Kimura, who was working diligently on behalf of me, and many other circumstances that were favorable to me. That was probably the reason. After a long stay in detention center, I was finally found not guilty. Although I was acquitted, the fact that I had killed a man remained. What a strange position to be in. I was so exhausted that I had no energy to feel happy about the verdict. As soon as I was released, I accompanied my father back to my hometown. But when I crossed the threshold of the house, I became a real sick person, having been a semi-sick person even before that, and had to live bedridden for about 6 months. I was bedridden for about half a year. This is how I ended up spending the rest of my life. My younger brother succeeded my father, and for the next 20 long years, I have lived in a kind of young retirement. But nowadays, I don't even agonize about it anymore. Mr. Ihara concluded his long story with a weak laugh. Then he continued, I'm sure you must have been bored with this trivial story. Now let me make you a cup of hot tea. He pulled out the tea utensils. I see that you are a man of considerable means, but I must say that you are a very unhappy man, Saito asked Ihara with a meaningless sigh. Have you recovered from your sleepwalking? The strange thing is that after the killing spree, it never happened again, as if I had forgotten about it. The doctor says it was probably due to too much stimulation at the time, Ihara answered. The person who was your friend, his name was Mr. Kimura, wasn't it? He was the one who first saw you have the seizure. Then there was the case of the clock, and then the case of the ghost in the cemetery, and in the other cases, what was it like? If you remember, would you mind telling me? Mr. Sato started to say something like this. His one and only eye glowed oddly. Yes, I would. All of them were similar events, with the exception of the murders, which were probably the most unusual when we wandered through the cemetery. The rest were usually things like breaking into a lodger's room. And they discovered you because you were always bringing other people's belongings or dropping your things in other people's rooms, Saito said, as if to confirm. That's true, but there may have been many times when that wasn't the case. Perhaps there were times when I wandered off to a place much further away than the cemetery, Ihara replied. Besides the first time your friend Kimura and you had an argument, and the time the company man saw you at the cemetery, have you ever been seen by anyone else? Mr. Saito asked. Yes, there were many others, it seems. Some people heard my footsteps walking around the corridor of the boarding house in the middle of the night, and others saw me breaking into other people's rooms. But why are you asking me such a question? Isn't it somehow like I am being investigated? Mr. Ihara smiled innocently, but he couldn't help but feel a little creeped out. I am sorry. I never intended it that way, but I just can't imagine that a person of your character would do such a terrible thing, even if it was in a dream. There is one more thing that I just don't understand. Please don't be offended. When I am handicapped in this way and live apart from the rest of the world, I tend to be suspicious of everything. By the way, have you ever thought about this? A somnambulist is a person who never knows the signs of sleepwalking, even when he or she is sleepwalking. They may walk around at night and chat, but in the morning they have forgotten all about it. In other words, they may think, I may be a somnambulist, only after someone else tells them. Doctors tell me that there are various physical symptoms, but they are very minor and can only be confirmed when accompanied by a seizure of sleepwalking, right? Perhaps it is because I am a skeptic myself, but I think you believe in your disease too carelessly. Mr. Ihara was beginning to feel some unexplainable uneasiness. It was not so much from Mr. Saito's story, but rather from something hidden behind his drawn face and appearance. However, Ihara suppressed his anger and replied, in fact, I had the same suspicions when I had my first attack, and I even prayed that I was wrong. But after having attacks continuously for such a long time, I could no longer feel so at ease. However, you seem to be unaware of one important thing, because not many people have witnessed your seizures. No, when you get right down to it, there was only one person who witnessed your seizure. Mr. Saito said. Mr. Ihara noticed that the other party seemed to be fantasizing about something extraordinary. It was indeed a terrible thing that ordinary people could not even conceive of. You said there was only one, Mr. Ihara said, but that is never the case. As I mentioned earlier, there are many people who have seen my back as I enter someone else's room or heard my footsteps as I walk down the hallway. Then, in the case of the cemetery, for example, I forget the name, but one office worker did indeed see me and even told me about it. Even if this were not the case, every time I had a seizure, someone else's items were always in my room, or my belongings were found in a very distant place, so there was no room for doubt. There is no way the items could have changed position on their own, Ihara explained, but Saito immediately refuted his explanation. No, the fact that the evidence was left behind after each seizure is what makes it all the more suspicious. Think about it. Those items could have been quietly relocated by someone else, not necessarily by your own hand. Also, you say that there were many witnesses, but in the case of the cemetery, and in other cases, all of the other cases where people saw your back, there is ambiguity. Even if they saw someone else who was not you, they might have assumed it was you if they saw a suspicious figure late at night because of their preconceived notion that you were a sleepwalker. In such cases, even if you spread a false rumor, you don't have to worry about being criticized by others. And besides, it's human nature to feel like it's an achievement to report even one new bit of gossip. Now, when you think about it this way, it's not impossible to say that the several people who claim to have witnessed your seizures and the numerous pieces of evidence were all the result of the magic tricks of one man. It is a very good magic trick. But a magic trick is still a magic trick, no matter how good it is. Mr. Ihara looked at Mr. Saito's face as he said this, as if he was taken aback. He had lost the power to collect his thoughts. Mr. Saito continued, and I think that this may have been a trick devised from the deepest thoughts of your friend Kimura. For some reason, Kimura wanted to kill the old owner of the boarding house. However, no matter how cleverly he killed the old landlord, once the murder was committed, the case would not be collected unless the culprit was inevitably found. So he needed to make someone else the culprit in his place. Moreover, in a way that causes as little trouble as possible to that person. If we assume for the moment that this Kimura person was in this position, wouldn't it have been a perfectly reasonable idea to make a trusting, good-natured person like you into thinking you were a sleepwalker and the culprit? Let's start with this assumption and see if it holds up in theory. Now, one day, this Kimura person tells you a made-up story that doesn't even exist. And, conveniently, you used to have a habit of sleepwalking as a child, which helps, and the Kimura story turns out to be surprisingly effective. Mr. Kimura will then try to spread the rumor of your sleepwalking further by various means, such as stealing watches and other items from other lodgers' rooms and leaving them in your room, or stealing your belongings without you noticing and dropping them elsewhere, or even by Mr. Kimura himself roaming the cemetery or the corridors of the lodging house pretending to be you. He will also use all sorts of publicity stunts to convince those around you that you are sleepwalking. Once you and those around you are completely convinced that you are sleepwalking, Mr. Kimura himself will murder his enemy, the old man, at the most opportune moment. He then quietly places the property in your room and leaves your belongings, which he stole beforehand, at the scene. Do you not think it is theoretical to imagine it in this way? You can't find a single irrationality in it, can you? And the result would be your surrender. Surely that must be very painful for you, but it is obvious that the penalty, if not acquittal, will be relatively light. Even if you receive some punishment, it is a crime committed because of illness, so it should not feel as painful as other crimes. At least that is what Mr. Kimura would have believed. He was not hostile toward you, but if he had heard your confession, he would have regretted it. Please don't be offended by my insulting words. However, when I heard your confession, I felt so sorry for you that I forgot myself and came up with a strange theory. However, I think that if you think about it this way, you will feel much better about the things that have been troubling your mind for the past 20 years, don't you? What I have said may be guesswork, but even if it is guesswork, it is a good thing if it makes sense and puts your mind at ease. Why did Kimura have to kill the old man? I cannot understand it because I am not Mr. Kimura himself, but I am sure that there must have been a deep and unspeakable reason. For example, yes, it was an act of revenge. Noticing Ihara's pale complexion, Saito suddenly stopped talking and nodded as if he was afraid of something. They remained like that, sitting opposite each other for a long time. The winter sun was setting early, and the light from the shoji screens was fading, leaving a chill in the air. Mr. Saito greeted Ihara timidly and left as if he were running away. Mr. Ihara did not even bother to see him off. He sat where he had been, still suppressing the rage that was rising in him. He was doing his best not to lose his train of thought at his unexpected discovery. But as time went on, his horrified complexion gradually returned to normal. Finally, a bitter, bitter smile crept onto his lips. He was certainly, though the ravages of war had changed the shape of his face. But even if that man was Kimura himself, what proof do I have to take revenge? I, a fool, can do nothing but accept Saito's, or rather Kimura's, self-serving pity. Ihara felt as if he had finally realized how foolish he had been. At the same time, he could not help but admire, rather than loathe, Kimura's wit, which was truly wonderful.
That's the end of the story. Now, I need to sell beach-related products during the summer. So I'm going to be very busy for a few months preparing for that, and I won't be able to post videos for a while. I plan to post more works by Edogawa Rampo at the end of September. It's going to get very hot in some countries, but I hope you all have a great summer season. See you in September.